Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and today we're going to have a little bit of theory crafting. You see, we are in Grand Cathay, and interestingly enough there are two undead factions here. Now, we're expecting undead Cathayans in the future in the form of the Jade-blooded, but this is why I'm kind of curious, because this looks like the areas that they might start, and there's a few things to discuss. So as you can see here, we're in Nonchang, which is in one of the southern regions of Grand Cathay, and this is being controlled by a faction known as the Jiangxi Rebels. These are a vampire count faction, and you know, that seems normal enough, but then when we start looking towards the other faction, literally right next to it we have the Dead Flag Fleet, which is rather curious considering that it's a Vampire Coast minor faction, and we haven't really seen minor factions for this race, as generally it's just the ones that we see down where Lufaharken is, I think, and that's pretty much it. So it's really curious that a new one was added in. Unlike the Jiangxi Rebels in Nonchang, which only had 2 settlements, this is the Jade River Delta, which has 3 settlements. Doesn't really have anything to do with it, I just want to point that out. It just feels kind of strange that a new minor Vampire Coast faction was added in, as really they were probably just adding these factions in just to have a little bit of variety for variety's sake. Yet we are aware that the Jade-blooded vampires do exist, as their bloodline was confirmed in a Lawbeards interview with myself and Lordmaster Sotek with Andy Hall, the principal writer of Warhammer 3. And he was pretty much just confirming that he was reading from a Cathayan army book that Games Workshop had created in the 8th edition standard, but let's be honest, it's probably the army book that we're going to see in Old World. Must be nice reading a army book for a very anticipated army for the tabletop, right? Not like fans like us haven't been waiting years and years and years. I guess we'll have to wait a bit years longer, given how Games Workshop is. Anyways, let's go back to Total War. So since we know that they're canon and we know that they're in the army book, it's likely that we're going to see something like that as DLC, because they're going to try and milk Cathay as much as possible, and it just makes sense to do some vampires. Vampires have always been really popular, which is really strange considering we haven't actually had vampire DLC since Warhammer 1. But the Jade-blooded could bring in some new flavor, as well, you know, we know next to nothing about them. They could have some unique stuff. What really confuses me is obviously the fact that we have 2 vampire count factions. It would make a lot of sense to make them a standard vampire faction of vampire counts, but we do have a lot of that, and we're expecting more of that to come. We're expecting Neferata, and some of us are expecting, well, Legendary Lords for the other factions. So unless they're hoping to have like 12, maybe more Legendary Lords for the vampires, I don't know if it just makes sense to add in more possible options for the Vampire Count faction. Whereas the Vampire Coast seems quite interesting too, the Dead Flag Fleet. So there's not too much to talk about there. We don't really know much other than the fact, like I said, it's the first time that we've seen another minor Vampire Coast faction being added into the game. However, what we do know is that Grand Cathay itself has a very powerful navy, and given the fact that this region is coastal, it kind of makes sense to have like a undead, dragon-blooded Shugengan as a legendary lord. Pairing with the fact of their powerful navy and the fact that Cathay uses a lot of gunpowder, it could be quite interesting to see like a minor faction being introduced, or as the new standard is, like a sub-faction where we get the Vampire Coast units, but just kind of reskinned to be undead Cathayans rather than pirates. We also know that piracy is still a thing when it comes to Cathayan lore, it's just we don't really know too much. This is the problem about when a race is centered on an army book that isn't available to the public. Well, the Legendary Lord would actually be Herakte, which we know nothing about barring the fact of very minor lore. He was there when the vampires were first created. He was actually part of Neferata's court, and he's one of the true-blooded vampires, one of the original ones. It's just we don't really know too much. He escaped far east when everything kind of went, you know, a little bit strange with the vampires, as the canon for it has always conflicted in various places, but the most recent canon does confirm that he went east, so we don't know what he looks like, we don't know exactly what he does. However, it's simple enough for them to just create a new character. Games Workshop probably already have for the army book. I'd say if the choice is between Vampire Counts and Vampire Coast, I think it makes a lot more sense for the Vampire Coast. As, well, we're expecting Vampire Count DLC with Neferata, like I said, and it makes sense that with Neferata, depending on how they do it, we'll probably get the last remaining units that we actually need, and then some. Like, we still don't know if they're going to do a Champions of Chaos style DLC or it's just going to be a basic Lord pack. But when it comes to the Vampire Coast, the Vampire Coasts haven't really been updated at all since their release, because there was no army book. We still don't know if there is going to be an army book for the Vampire Coast in general. But adding in another Legendary Lord, which gives another start on the other side of the world, and then maybe a few units here and there might work out quite well. Maybe they've got inspiration to write some new stuff, maybe Games Workshop have had some inspiration, and that would then flesh out the roster a little bit more, as they will start to struggle a little bit when it comes to variety, in the sense of, look at all the other races in the series right now. The grand majority of them have massive rosters. Hell, even the monogods finally have a massive roster. So this kind of works out in two ways. It adds in a new and interesting character that many people are kind of curious about, mostly because we want to see what a Jade-blooded really is. Maybe does it have its own lore of magic? Does it have new spells? Or is it just like an addition of the lore of vampires? Or even just, say for example, the lore of the deep's just getting changed up a bit. Hell, it could even just be like a twisted version of the lore yin and yang. The biggest question I have is, are the Jade-blooded vampires just dragon-blooded Shungen but undead version? Because can that actually happen? We don't know just yet. Mostly because they are children of dragons, and when dragons turn undead, they're mostly thralls. They don't really act on their own accord. So does it keep its sentience? Because it is still human, but it has dragon blood. It's just some questions which might not be the most exciting for people, but it does have a lot of stuff for lore. It's the same thing as, I kind of made a joke once, maybe the dragon-blooded could also form as a resource for the blood dragon vampires to cure them of their ailments, because yeah, dragon blood again. I don't know if they added those minor factions as a hint. It kind of feels like it, at least more so the Vampire Coast one more than anything else. We're gonna have to wait and see. I'm holding out hope for Jade-blooded in the future. They wouldn't make such a thing about it to answer on the interview if there wasn't some sort of plan, and they wouldn't be in the army book mentioned in the lore if there wasn't a plan to see them somewhere, shape or form in the future, whether that be Old World or Warhammer 3, but I think it kind of just mixes up. I did see some suggestions from some people saying, oh, maybe they're just going to be a Cathayan faction with vampire units because of the whole ancestor worship stuff. But I doubt that's going to be a thing, because I think it just devalues the fact that we have already way too many undead factions. And really, Cathay has been said to have so many different cultures as a part of it. I don't think that adding in a undead faction is going to add variety. Whereas, you know, we're waiting for the monkey warriors and all that type of stuff. And yeah, adding in those vampires could basically just mean nothing. But it's important for us to discuss, as keeping these types of conversations going is what Creative Assembly gauge interest from, because yes, they do check out these videos, they do check out the forums, so it's important to keep it going for Creative Assembly to know, yeah, look, they want this, and then they'll ask GW and all that type of stuff. But with all that being said, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Let's start the discussion, and I'll see you all again very, very soon.